You can have terabytes of data, but it doesn't contain the expertise that your engineer or even your user has accumulated in the industry over the last 20, 30 years in their brain. So knowledge first AI is about the combination of human knowledge and data to build better models than predictive models than you could do alone with data.
Hello, everyone. My name is Stephen Parton, and you are listening to the Feedback Loop on Singularity Radio. This week, my guest is entrepreneur and technologist Christopher Nguyen, who, in addition to starting his own companies, has spent 4 decades working at some of the world's biggest tech giants. In this episode, we focus on exploring the many facets of artificial intelligence, including Christopher's ideas around knowledge first AI, bad training data for AI, issues with the black box, GPT3, deepfakes, and a whole lot more. So without further ado, let's just jump into it. Everyone, please welcome to the feedback loop, Christopher Nguyen. So, one of the places that I think would be interesting to start with you is to go through a little tour of your history because over the past 40 years, I would say you've worked at some of the biggest companies, tech companies specifically on the planet, Intel, HP, Xerox, and Google, just to name a few. So being so close to these companies that are spearheading innovation in the way that they have, what kind of changes have you seen over the decades in terms of how the tech industry is functioning and how these companies are responding to the changing of the times?
Well, actually, one part of my uh, work career, if you will, that
Mm,
I haven't shared, that I haven't talked about, is that I did work when I was in high school. I spent a year at NASA Ames Research Center.
mm,
And this is going to date me, but the project I was working on was to identify constellations, star maps, right, that are very promising for potential for discovery of extrasolar planetary systems. So basically, that was before we even saw one.
mm-hmm.
So you can sort of maybe that's 19th century or something. But there was a time when we didn't see anything outside our in terms of planetary systems other than our own. That was actually my first science and engineering job. That was the senior at high school. But since then, I've had the opportunity of participating and working in so many different waves of technology, and I'm perhaps one of those weird people that can learn very quickly and adapt to each new wave. So today I'm working, of course, on AI and specifically industrial AI. I think one of the biggest things that has changed, you can take Silicon Valley as a proxy, right? Um, it has shifted all the way from manufacturing, right?
Mm,
Making what we call the atoms, right? Making transistors and chips and so on, all the way through the software and through consumer and so on. And the interesting thing that's happening now, particularly as it relates to Singularity Radio and Ray Kurzweil and so on, is that um, we are finally touching human intelligence, right?
mm.
And there's something qualitatively different about that. People like to say, it's different this time as a joke, right? But I do feel that it is different this time. We've always augmented ourselves, right? The glasses that you and I are wearing,
Mm.
that's augmentation, right? And Google, we would cease to function if we didn't have access to our Google and our mobile devices. So I think the augmentation of technologies is not new at all. A chair was the technology at some point. But I think there's something very qualitatively different, very powerful, and also very disturbing
Mm.
when we think about augmenting our minds, right? With things that may be possibly smarter than us.
Yeah. Well, and recently you founded a company, and pardon me if I pronounce this incorrectly, but I think it's Idomatic or I.
Absolutely, that's correct. Yes, that's
Yeah,
how we pronounce it.
and so it's a focus on what I think you call AI engineering. What is that exactly? And can you kind of take us through a tour of what the company is focusing on?
We are focused on something called knowledge first AI, right? And that is to distinguish it from knowledge second and knowledge third, right? Otherwise, you always have knowledge in AI. But Silicon Valley, for the most part today, and I use the term Silicon Valley here as a proxy for the general consciousness, the kinds of things that you hear, you read in TechCrunch and Fortune magazine and newspapers and so on. So that bubble is very much concerned with data first AI, if I can coin that term, meaning in 2012, right? That was when the cat article came out, and my friends at Google had worked on YouTube videos that saw cat videos, and eventually somehow that deep neural network, it would sort of emerged an understanding, or at least the ability to identify cats versus dogs versus Britney Spears and so on. And by the way, there's an aside there that they didn't start out. Kwok Lei, who worked on that project, actually started out, trying to identify Jennifer Aniston, but
Nice.
but referring to it as cats is more user friendly.
Yeah.
Um, um, we Since then, the industry has been very much about digital AI, right? Bits in, bits processed, bits out. And that turns out to be the easier part. In retrospect, it makes sense. We work on the low hanging fruit first, but the hard part is where AI or machine learning hits the physical industry, which you know ahead of our being able to upload ourselves, we're still physical beings, right? We still drive cars, we still eat fish. So there's a $25 trillion industry out there. And for the past five years, they've been thinking we're doing something wrong because we're not succeeding at this. And by the way, I was in that. My previous company was acquired by Panasonic, which, as you may know, makes all of the Tesla batteries, has a coal supply chain for refrigeration, automotive, and so on. And this industry has been struggling with how do we take advantage of this thing? This is, to increase revenues, to make better products, and so on. And they repeatedly run into walls. And it turns out that wall is because, and this is a somewhat surprising, but I would like to say no longer controversial. There's not enough data to train in the same way that we do in the digital industry, when you're trying to predict clicks of the ads or, your social networks and so on. So knowledge first AI turns out to be a key solution to that, which is to apply human knowledge, domain expertise, things that are outside that data set. You can have terabytes of data, but it doesn't contain the expertise that your engineer or even your user has accumulated in the industry over the last 20, 30 years in their brain. So knowledge first AI is about the combination of human knowledge and data to build better models than predictive models than you could do alone with data. And that's it, depending on who you talk to, that's intuitively obvious, or it's actually quite controversial. But that's what we focus on.
And obviously, you're going to be biased here, but how is it working? I mean, does it feel like this knowledge first approach is starting to make some inroads in the industry, in the material space, where like the data first approaches hadn't in the past?
As a concept, it is completely proven. I would say it that way. But let me break that down though, so it
Yeah.
doesn't sound like magic. Uh, if you have a Tesla, when you drive a car, today that is self-driving, and if you have the latest version FSD beta, it is pretty much driving itself, around 90% of the time. There's a lot of human knowledge built into that, a lot of it. Without that, you would not have that. So that's what I mean by as a concept, it is proven, right? That's number one. Number two, when you talk to the industrial people, the manufacturers, the wind farm people, the aerospace people, and so on, all of that makes a lot of sense to them. So that you don't have to sell that idea to them. They say, "I always knew this," right? The real challenge is, do you do that sort of manually, right? Like okay, if I buy into something like that, is there an automated way to do that?
Right.
So over the next 5 years, you're going to see more and more companies like ours trying to automate that process to make it easier, right? And you can already sort of see emerging recently, Chat GPT and so on, right? Those tools are going to be like foundational models are going to be much more powerful, not as those iterations. Those are what I call demos, right? But the real thing is going to be the ability to translate automatically for the first time, if you will, right? Human knowledge, natural language, spoken words, written words, and so on, into some kind of structured form, which can then be combined with our very structured machine learning kind of domain, right? And that's the innovation that's happening today with these companies, including ours.
Yeah, and you touched on the collaborative aspect there of the human and the technology and GPT for that matter. And thinking back to Deep Blue beating Gary Kasparov in 97 to GPT-3, showing breakthroughs right now that are really just blowing people's minds, for lack of a better phrase. The common fear is that in a lot of ways, this AI is starting to make humans obsolete. So, as an advocate for this human AI collaboration, how do you address that concern that humans are actually becoming, in fact, obsolete?
Well, let me first get something out of the way, right? I'm not
Mm-hmm.
one of those techno optimists that say, oh, it's automatically going to be, fine and dandy. So
Sure.
there are a lot of hidden dangers in AI, just as there are with any tool and any powerful tools, right? The power of a tool is not inherent within the tool, but where it is applied and the scale at which it is applied, right? This we have something, even before AI, the internet is something where we can for the first time, reach 7 billion people. 100 years ago, you do something, no matter how smart you were, you probably reach 100 people and then 1,000 people and 10,000 people and so on. So the reach alone is to be respected, if not feared, right?
Mm-hmm.
So having said that, there are intentioned ways that we can say let's steer it in this direction rather than let it flow in any potentially bad directions. And I think one of the things is what we just touched on just now. We augment, right? Technology has always augmented our abilities, right? And so take what we can see today already, right? GPT, Lambda, various large language models, and sort of multimodal, including images and soon sound, speech and video and so on. It's going to make us much more powerful
Mm-hmm.
than we were before that, just as any technology has done. And I think if you sort of try to repeat that, maybe you can't predict 50 years, as Ray Kurzweil has, but at any given iteration, you can just say, well, I'm gonna try to ride on top of this in some predictable, responsible way. And I think that's my optimism. Of course, if you extend that, then it does get to something which may be a little disturbing, but
Mm-hmm.
the future has always been disturbing, right? So, for example, augmenting your own mind, right, directly with these models, I think the path of the future, even though it seems very disturbing to some today. But
Yeah.
just as me sitting here in the little box with a laptop can be quite disturbing to somebody who worked in the field 100 years ago.
Yeah. So would you say then that that brain computer interface approach that you're kind of touching on there is a natural place we'll end up if the trajectory continues without too much steering, or do you think that that's a place that we do have to steer ourselves towards to maybe keep that symbiotic beneficial collaboration rather than something that's more like an us versus them?
Yeah, I think we absolutely need steering. There's sort of a
Mm-hmm.
low resolution and high resolution steering, right? I think that is the one of the optima that we will find ourselves as a human species, one way or another.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but within that path, there are very disturbing ways to navigate that, and there are more user-friendly ways to navigate that. I think the steering at that high resolution, particularly as it touches the mind, right, the human mind, which we know
Mm-hmm.
very little about, and which really control ourselves, like our actual selves, who we are. I think we need to be very careful about navigating that. But to say not to do that, I think who is it? Kelly of Wired has a term that I really like. He has a book that says what technology wants, right?
Mm-hmm.
You think about technology as its own species. I think what technology, of course, it's a cumulative effect of human will, but it looks like technology wants to proliferate. Technology wants to be integrated. Technology wants to evolve, and so technology wants that. What are we going to do to control and to manage the navigation, through that path?
Yeah. And before we move away from GPT, just because I think it's such a relevant topic right now, I don't know if this is beyond your scope at all, but could you maybe just explain how it works just a little bit for our listeners who might not be quite familiar with that? And maybe you can even add your thoughts about, is it as good as we think it is? Is there a lot of hype right now that is unfounded, or is this something that's truly opening the door for a revolution in the field, really?
Right. That's a interesting discussion. There are always going to be extremes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And usually you can assume that extremes are going to be wrong, but they help form the boundaries or the brackets for the rails for the discussion. There's extreme that say this thing is this thing is sentient. It already it should be treated as another organism and have rights and things like that. And then there's the extreme that says, oh, this doesn't mean anything. It's just a bunch of bits that move and just repeat what we say. I think both of those extremes are wrong
Mm-hmm.
as it relates to Chat GPT, or more fundamentally the large language models, the foundational models behind it. Um, and relating to technology generation that I've been through, another thing that I worked on at Intel was the first flash devices. To think about the very first transistors, and now you've got probably dozens of them on your body. Um, I usually, very often, always know exactly what's happening behind the scenes,
Mm-hmm.
right? But that does not take away much of the wonderment that I feel, right? I like to say there's a difference between knowing and feeling, right? Both
Mm-hmm.
good and bad. Sometimes it takes I need to knock my head before I really feel that, okay, that's not a good idea, even though I can logically work it out. So I think GPT and what a lot of people now see Chat GPT is one of those wonderment, right? Like exactly what's happening behind the scene, but it's still awesome, right? It's like the first moment Steve Jobs, 2007, stand on the stage and started, swiping the screen, and then the thing moves and it speeds up and slows down. It's like, wow, right? So there's this wow moment, and I'm one of those people that say I want to relish this wow moment, right? I don't want to dismiss it, and I don't want to be too fearful with it. So coming back to just what it does and then how it does it. Um, Today, it is possible, and I think most of your audience will already be familiar with this. If they haven't, they definitely should open an account and try it out. It is possible to go to a chat window with ChatGPT. And by the way, OpenAI is not the only company doing this, right? So this is just one of the examples. You can intelligently have a dialogue with this thing, right? And 5 years ago, 5 short years ago, we were talking about initiative and creativity, right? This thing appears, and I'm not saying underlying, I'm just describing, not yet saying what's underneath. It appears to have knowledge about the world, right? It's not just repeating something. And when as a tool, I'm already using it to generate ideas. Maybe I shouldn't share this. It's kind of a temporary advantage. When we deal with a new customer, a new use case that I don't know the space really reasonably well, we're already using it to ask what use cases might you hey ChatGPT or whatever is there, might we apply this knowledge first AI to, and it gives pretty reasonable suggestions, not necessarily correct, but certainly much better than me alone. And then I would take those 5 ideas that it gives me, and I would research and be very efficient at it. If I had to use just a month ago, I would have to Google and sort of try to learn the area and so on. So
Yeah.
so in other words, it's already, I'm going to use this word, it's already teaching me something, right? At
Mm.
least as a friend, right? Maybe not smarter than me, or maybe it is smarter than, but it's more than a dictionary, it's more than Google, right? It seems to have an understanding and a knowledge of the world. And what's really behind it is no more, but also no less than having fed a very basic, at the core, it's basic. I'm not trivializing the engineering prowess that this was, but at the core, there's just a learning algorithm, right? Which is generally speaking a deep neural network. And that deep neural network simply, when it does the computation of the so-called inference, you give a bunch of inputs, it multiplies those inputs by some weights, and then it sums them up, and then it sends those outputs to the next layer. And that's it. And then you repeat it, 27 times and 30 times and so on. When you train it, then you basically say, just try it. And then if you make a mistake, right, like if you predict the wrong output, I'll tell you. And you do that a billion times. And then after a while, it sort of learns, right? What it's really learning is what we call the statistical distribution of the underlying data. I hope that's not too complicated. It's like the world is not random, right? The fact
Right.
that I'm looking at you, you're looking at me, we're not a random collection of pixels. If it were, it would be like white noise, right? um, so so the fact that it's not random, that means there is a statistical pattern in everything.
Mm-hmm.
So when I speak a sentence, there's a sense to it, right? It follows a certain sequence and so on. And so if you look at two, three, four, a million sentences, you begin to see correlation among these things. So then it emerges that the word good appears in certain places next to other words and other sentences and other paragraphs and other articles and other collection of articles in a certain ordered manner, right? And so it has been really just a matter of scaling that idea up, right, to terabytes of data. And of course, it requires a lot of compute to do that. But what happens is that once you do that, there emerges an embedded understanding. I'm
Mm-hmm.
going to use that word without much embarrassment, right? a sufficient sort of clinically
Yeah.
fit the definition of understanding such that it can spit back out not just memorizations, but the ability to combine the words I say and the concept that it understands so that it spits out something like, for example, I just gave you the suggestions of use cases that might
Mm-hmm.
be of interest to an industry I know very little about. Right. So that's large language models in a nutshell. And the thing that I would extend it to is that language models is a key set, but it's not only text, right?
Right.
Very very soon, we're already seeing text and images being correlated, and that's why you have something like Dolly, where you can type in a description and it generates an image. And now Facebook or Meta Research has created something where you type in sentences that generates a video, right? These are sort of generative capability. It has to have something where it can generate things. It's not just repeating things, and that's where we are.
Are you concerned about things like deepfakes and kind of where this is going? The ability for us to create text, custom text this quickly and videos this quickly.
Yeah,
It feels like there's a lot of room for bad actors to have some impact with these tools.
absolutely. If you look at my writings and my tweets, even up to 5, 10 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
again, this is my non-techno optimist credentials, right? I've warned about these things, and some of my uh, yeah, let me give you an analogy to economists, right? We call it the dismal science, right? And for the most part, before behavioral economics, economists work in steady states, right? Kind of like
Mm.
in the limit, right? In the long run, it should be like this. And then it was Keynes, I think, Keynes, who said, in the long run, we're all dead, right? Uh, so that's how I see these disruptive technologies, right? Yeah, of course, in the long run, we will adjust as a species. We will say, well, just like today, when I see you on video, I don't jump and I said, oh my God, who's this tiny guy, right? But but back in when movies first came out, there's this sort of famous example of people running away as the train approaches on the moving picture, right? So as a species, we will adapt, we will adjust. but it takes time. It's a dynamic situation, and it takes time. And if technology evolves faster than sort of our biological rate of being able to adapt, what does that mean, right?
Yeah.
Are we always going to be falling behind? We're sort of one cycle behind, and then two cycles behind, three cycles behind. So things like deepfakes, of course. Today, I think it's still fairly easy to persuade a bunch of people. By the way, here's another thing. Uh, when we talk about these things, we make the assumption that humanity or humans are grounded in truth and justice and equality, and it's not true. We're not about that at all.
Yeah.
Uh, I would, I and others would love to be lied to, right? And so if you give me something that is a lie, but that conforms with my desired reality, I will use that. So I think deepfakes, perhaps one of the most disturbing thing about deepfakes is not that it fools people, but it allows people to fool themselves. I think that's and that's a decade long thing. I don't think humans we will settle into this new technology that fast.
Yeah, there seems to be a running trend on the show lately, and people I've talked to where one of the big points made is we're judging AI so severely to a standard that goes well beyond what we hold our human counterparts to, who are far more capable of destructive behavior right now. And it's very interesting that AI's progress seems to be surfacing our awareness of just how bad some of our human behavior really is.
Right, right. And to be sure, I'm not saying that to excuse AI.
No,
I'm
no, no.
saying that to be even more careful
Hmm.
that as we say AI must be better, that we are actually not worse, right?
Hmm. Well, and to that note, I believe you've talked in the past about the blind spots that Silicon Valley has, and some of the ethical considerations around these tools. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I like to talk not of first order things because people have already heard about that before,
Mm,
but maybe there are second order things that are of concern, right? Uh, One of them is the belief by a large school of thought, and I'm not saying good versus evil here. It's kind of like the separation between intent and impact. You don't mean bad, but your impact can be very bad, and so
mm,
you need to recognize that. One of them is I'm just here to build the best model I can. The rest is someone else's problem, right? Don't expect me to protect the world from this perfect model that I'm building. You know, you do that afterwards or
right.
before or whatever, right? You prepare the data and you decide to do with the output. My job is to build the quote unquote purest model possible. I think that's number one, that's a fallacy.
Mm,
um, when you build a model, there are biases that you put into it. And I use the word bias not just in the colloquial sense of saying bias is bad, but like I think most people well know now machine learning would not work without bias, right? But bias is this what we call GC level electrical engineering, right? There has to be a bias for things to work. Um, so that's number one. Number two is that um, you can look at things as a system view or you can look at things as a component view, right? It comes back to this sense of saying, I'm only responsible for this part, the rest is someone else's problem. um, I think it's okay to say I'm responsible for this part, but I think the next sentence has to be I'm also very concerned with how this part is built and how it's being used, right? I sometimes I use the example of a part of our society that says, guns don't kill people, right? People kill people. Only the last party is responsible. I don't subscribe to that view.
yeah.
So I think that's perhaps a reminder to myself and to my buddies around Silicon Valley of that responsibility, particularly because when I was a kid, I mean, as an engineer kid, right? My technology, I talk about Flash, right? And I also
Hmm.
worked on Unicode. It probably reached 10,000 people. But now when you write some bits of code, some of us have the ability to reach a billion people. So it's the same code, it's the same model, but you have vastly greater power now, and you got to be more responsible.
Well, and we opened with talking a little bit about how maybe Silicon Valley and technology and the industry has changed. And one thing I know as a computer scientist myself and from talking to people, it seems there's more movement away from a well-rounded humanities-based education around this to something that's more like boot camps and code camps. And that makes me wonder to what you were talking about there. It's a bit concerning, perhaps, maybe that the people who are creating code that reaches a billion people don't have a humanities education, aren't thinking about philosophy, aren't thinking about these deeper issues. Is that something you're seeing maybe in the younger employees at these companies, or a concern maybe that you have about where we're going forward with such an emphasis on STEM without
Yeah.
any awareness of the other side of things?
Well, let me share part of my credentials here before I speak is that I'm involved in the creation and the launching of the new university in Vietnam called Fulbright University Vietnam. It's a part of the Fulbright program out of
Yeah.
Kennedy School and so on. And interestingly, and the thing that I like about it is that it is not an engineering university. It is a liberal arts program.
Mm.
Liberal arts with strong science and engineering foundations. And if you look at that, that institution alone, um, whether you like it or not, it's going to be true that over the next 10, 20 years, the graduates of that institution are going to be leaders of society, leaders of business and industry and so on. Forget about government, right? Um, but that's the kind of liberal arts plus strongly founded strong foundations in STEM can produce. But I have to confess to something that I has puzzled me. Like how do you articulate the value of this other than, of course, we all feel good when we say, you got to be well-rounded and have the humanities and so on. But I listened to a podcast recently, and I think there's a professor at UCLA. I think her name is Kate Hales, and she gave a really good pitch that I totally buy and that I'm going to use, right? And she's a Caltech graduate, I think in chemistry or physics or something, undergraduate, but then her PhD is in like literature, and she's a professor of literature, and she explains the value of literature this way, which is, and that really resonated with me. She says the ability, what literature gives you is the ability to step into the mind of other people and other cultures and experience things that otherwise would be unreachable to you, right?
Yeah.
And thereby become a better person, right? And I absolutely believe in the. I've lived in many countries. I was a refugee when I was a child, so I've dealt with pirates, believe it or not, and prime ministers, and I think that diversity, that has concretely helped me, right? And in machine learning, we also see the same thing, right? Data variance is a good thing, so as not to overfit.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's a long way of saying I was very excited to hear a really good way to sell, liberal arts education.
Well, I mean, and to your point, I mean, the brain is potentially the best machine learning algorithm, the best inference engine that's out there. So, I mean, if having a more well-rounded education increases your model of the universe, I would
That's
expect
right.
that you would become a better engineer because you would be able to use that
Yeah.
model.
Anybody who's multilingual knows that learning the next language makes you better at the languages you already know.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we're seeing that in large language models as well.
Well, yeah, but there's an interesting irony here, though, too. As I'm thinking about this, though, that some of our most advanced machine learning, some tools like GPT. If I'm correct me if I'm wrong here, but I mean this is all still very much black box AI, right? So regardless of what kind of background and model of the world we have, we aren't really aware or able to shape too much what's on inside that black box. I mean, would you agree with that?
Well, I agree with it in the sense of where we are, right? In other words, there's a whole discipline emerging called alignment, right? Which is, you go back to 2001 and so on. How do you align your robot or your sentient being that you've just created with your intent? right? How do you align your own child with your values, for example, right? Um, uh, but at least as biological systems, we've sort of learned the art of teaching, right? And then hopefully we get what we want. Um, so I think alignment is absolutely is so important, right? Because if we just build the thing and then okay, let it run wild, then it will go in some random direction, right? There will not emerge a kind of ethical concerns granted that ethics itself is cultural, right? But it doesn't mean there's nothing. Just because something is multiple doesn't mean there's no direction to it. Um, so so the field of alignment is just an emerging one. I don't know of a university class that talks, that teaches sort of AI alignment, but folks at OpenAI and Google are sort of trying their best, right? Bubbling around. In fact, ChatGPT3 is not a model advancement, right? The underlying model is still GPT, I think 3.5 now, the internally numbered. But the reason that they're able to release it is that there's been a lot of alignment work done on the underlying model that said, okay, now this thing is going to go out there. And what was that? What was that Microsoft thing that Microsoft released Tay or something that got racist after
Yeah,
after a few days?
a few days
Um,
on Twitter.
right. So alignment is very important. And here's my optimistic um, take on it, which is well, first of all, how do you think alignment work is being done? It's certainly not being done by purely feeding it, quote unquote, the right data and adjusting the weights, right? Because as these models become more capable of adjusting their weights from the conversations with you and me, the alignment work is being done by telling it in English what you want. And then the weights adjust, right? So the interesting thing is these things sort of emerging as, let's say, little children, very smart children, very knowledgeable children. Uh, but you can start to talk to them, right? And so they're reaching us. They're reaching our ability, our normal communication protocol, language, and so on. They no longer are restricted just to bits and bytes and the images, and then hopefully something correct emerges. Uh, so I think again, coming back, I think you're right in the large that we should be very concerned about this thing I'm going to call alignment. But it's also at the same time our ability, the tools available to us to do alignment is becoming more accessible, more powerful as well.
Yeah. This might be an impossible question because it might be pretty akin to the hard problem of consciousness, but I was discussing this conversation actually over the weekend with my friend Amin, and we were getting into this idea or this question of whether the black box is something that can ever be solved. If this is an issue that's just temporary, and then eventually we'll be able to figure out how to look at those weights and figure out how to trace an output back to its source. Do you think that is something that is feasible, or is that pretty unrealistic?
Well, that's actually some people may dismiss that as the a naive question,
Hmm.
or it could be a very profound question. I'm going to sort of unpack why I think that.
Take either
I
road.
think people may dismiss it. Exactly. Well, I think it's a profound question, right? But I want people not to misunderstand that it is a naive question. Uh, at the mechanical level, it seems like a naive question because we know exactly what's going on. Like we know this better than we know our brains, right? Because we can actually look at what's happening. We can see the bits in the byte flowing. We actually created all these inference algorithms and we know exactly, well, the thing is clearly multiplying those numbers and so on. So in that sense, it's a complete white box, right? But I think you're right, it's a black box in that we don't know really, right? We don't know, we don't have a good handle how this quote unquote intelligence it has emerged, right? In other words, there's layers to this thing, and then somewhere we make a leap. So that leap is kind of that equivalent black box, right? Okay. At some level, we say, okay, I just know this thing works, and I'm going to use it, right? I'm going to use it for my homework. I'm going to use it for my proposal, and so on. So I think maybe the term black box could be problematic with some people who say, I really know what's going on here. Uh, so maybe I'll shift it as sort of the ability, going back to the question of alignment, right? Is there intent here, right? How can you say there is no intent if there's emerging understanding, and does intent matter? right? I talked earlier about, it doesn't matter what you intend, the impact is the same, right? But as society, as humans, we do sort of we dole out punishment for crime very differently if there is intent or not. Just this morning there was a question in Congress about Sam Bankman-Fried, like was it willful ignorance or who the hell cares? I mean, I lost $1 million, right?
Yeah.
So so I think that's a challenging question, right? Um, because that's why you say correctly. I think it comes back to our sense of consciousness, right? Consciousness, intent, and so on. It's very these are not very well defined words, by the way, that we think we know, right? Because these are sort of very intuitive to us. So if we're not ourselves grounded in a good grammar and a good vocabulary for these words, how can we begin to if we can't introspect, then how can we inspect these machines and say they do or do not have this intent? So I think that's a fascinating area for research, and I wish, by the way, that the branches, psychology, neuroscience, and machine learning, computer science would work together better. I think it will, but in the beginning, there's always these turf wars.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think that it'd be possible, I guess, to I'm going to build on that question a little bit with something like GPT? Do you think it would be possible to learn where the answer comes from in terms of the data set that it most heavily pulls on? And I mentioned this specifically for something like Dolly or Midjourney, where a lot of things that people are concerned about is that it's basically stealing somebody's art and stealing their art style and creating a new piece of art using their work as the prime data set they were trained on. And there's a question of whether or not we could somehow maybe give some kind of attribution or even financial support to an artist whose data set is maybe the largest contributor to the output from one of these systems. Does that seem something that's possible, or that you think would be an interesting application?
Yeah, I haven't thought about this deeply enough, and certainly I'm, don't know enough about the fields to say, here's my answer. I do know I have this mental model of creativity, or a large class of creativity. Uh, I'm going to say this. I don't want to trivialize it, but I can certainly talk a lot about my own creativity. It has been the intersection of two things, which may be obvious, but that were previously somehow unrelated. And then you combine two ideas together. By the way, that's why, I inherently believe, pop psychology, that's why creative people tend to be, what's the word? They tend to have synesthesia as well, right? Because, their brains are wired in such a way that the different modes kind of intersect. I really think a big part, if not all of creativity, is about that two unrelated things, maybe, in a rare blue moon, three unrelated things coming together. And so, this idea of hyperspace, right? Many different dimensions. You have two straight lines, and they don't meet, but then in some rare moment, they in hyperspace they cross, and that moment you have this burst of creativity. Oh, eureka, right? I thought of how to combine engineering with music or something like that. So if you subscribe to that idea, if you believe that idea, then how do we attribute, right? The act of combining an idea of yours, an idea of mine, or a field of yours and a field of mine, if we have always acknowledged the source, but also credited the person or the thing or the organization that does the actual intersection, then I think attribute, how much stealing did actually take place, right? I'm not saying there isn't ever, right? There's straight plagiarism. Uh, but I guess what I'm saying is don't underestimate the ability or the emergent creativity, at least by this definition, right? The ability of these machines to combine two heretofore unrelated concepts and come out with something that is, I'm going to call it its own.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, do you think then, as somebody who has worked at the intersection of AI and business pretty heavily, that we're going to have to reconsider intellectual property law?
Oh, absolutely. IP law. Yes. In fact, I was on the record 2000. I want to say 2014 at a meeting, at a corporate meeting. It was actually Honeywell, a good friend of mine, Rhonda, Germany, who was the CTO, CMO there. And there was an IP lawyer, right? And you have to backcast yourself to 2014, 15. So none of this was obvious, right? Um, and we were talking about open source, right? Back then, open source software. And I made a controversial statement, and I said, corporate assets, insofar as software and so on, going forward, it's not going to be source code. It's going to be the models, right? So the point is that shift alone was, when I said that, there was no resonance, right? First of all, what the hell is models, right? Um, uh, but it's pretty obvious now, right? Companies say, well, I'm not gonna be the best in the world about these learning algorithms, right? Not even public data sets, but my intellectual property are two things. Number one, data sets that are unique to me, right? And my domain knowledge. That's how that's how I'm gonna innovate, and where my edge is. It's not gonna be building these shared models. So that's already happening. So what you say is already true. People have to rethink what is IP, right? The value of those lines of code, those are learning algorithms. Even if you own them, somebody's going to come up with a different algorithms to do learning and so on. It's not that valuable. What you want to protect are knowledge, right? We come back to the word knowledge, right? Knowledge, whether it is embedded in these models or knowledge that is embedded in my human experts, right? My human workers and so on. That's what's going to be unique going forward, right? And so absolutely, what people want to protect, whether IP law changes or not. I think these what I call industry intuitions will reveal themselves.
Well, and as we look forward a little bit more, maybe to bring a bit of a closing to the conversation, as somebody who has navigated these waters and has seen the disruption, with your entrepreneurial background and your skills in AI, what kind of advice would you give somebody who's interested in entering this domain? And what are some of the, I guess, most dominant emerging areas where you think people should be paying attention to?
Well, I think the broadest brush that I can paint is it's an exciting new economy, right? Um, and that is to contrast with the old economy. And this has been always true, right? You want to be connected to the new economy. It's not that you have to be an engineer, you don't have to be a product manager, you don't have to be a podcaster, you don't have to be a creator, whatever, right? But there is this emerging new economy, and it's a new economy with new business models, new tools, new audiences, new customers, and so on, which contrasts itself with the old economy of how you make money, how you learn, and so on. I think that this is certainly the advice that I give my own children, right? Like, make sure whatever you do that you are connected to the new economy. And that means being aware of what's happening, and maybe not up to the minute, right? But be very willing to adopt new tool, sort of to keep your mind open, not to be fearful. I don't think fear has ever led to greatness, right? Maybe it'll protect you for the day or the month. But I think there's a reason why people, creative people, or people who create things, tend to be optimists, right? Because you have to believe in the possibilities, right? So I would say some of the things that you and I touch on, right? A number of years ago, it would have been social networks, right? Internet, mobile, and so on. And now Chat GPT, right? There's talk about how it's going to destroy education, but those are sort of coming from a static assumption, right? That the world doesn't change. The world always changes, right? People will change, people will adapt. And so if you sort of go to, Wayne Gretzky, go to where the puck is, or try to anticipate it, have because things are changing faster and faster, right? So that is qualitatively different. Don't assume that you're going to be taking on one job and stay with it for the rest of your career. Those days are gone, right? But be very flexible, and be willing to just for some people that maybe learn Python, right, and take a data science course. For others, it may be taking on a marketing role that is talking about these foundational models as opposed to something from the old economy. Over the next 5 years, I think it's going to be a whole bunch of experiments, companies that are trying to leverage these foundational models and do transformative things. There are already gimmicks, of course, right? And you can temporarily make some money with it, right? Write somebody's essay and write them letters and so on. But I do think over the next 5 years, there's going to be a whole bunch of very large companies, institutions that are founded on this idea of I can take a foundational model and I can apply it, right, in what Sam Altman called this middle layer, right, to music, to art, to medicine, to biology, to cold fusion, whatever. Um, we want to stand on the shoulder of giants, and there's an emerging giant, right? That giant is the foundational models. So make sure you stay on top of that.
Yeah, that's great advice, Christopher. Well, I want to thank you for your time, man. But before we go, I want to give you a chance to leave us with any closing thoughts, point people in any direction you'd like to talk about anything at all.
Well, if you're interested in if you found these thoughts interesting and want to reach me, or talk about knowledge first AI as it applies to the industrial economy. I'm very excited about it. It sounds stodgy, but I like to call it the physical economy, because when you say industrial, people think, oh, that must be like large machines and so on. But no, if you eat a fish, you care about the physical economy.